A group of soldiers ineligible for the draft become the most decorated unit in U.S. history. Red Lipstick's Marine Corps origins, and a duck that stormed the shores of Tarawa. In honor of America's 250th anniversary, here are 5 pieces of U.S. military history you might not know. 1. When you think of red lipstick, superstars like Taylor Swift, Marilyn Monroe, or Rihanna may come to mind, but the iconic cosmetic has a unique history thanks to the Marine Corps. In the lead up to World War II, the Nazi regime outwardly disdained makeup, going so far as to ban painted women from Nazi party functions. But UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill had the opposite opinion, rolling out the 1941 Beauty is Your Duty campaign on the theory that unkempt women would be bad for morale. It was a different era. The patriotism of a maintained woman grew in popularity across the Allied nations. Even the iconic Rosie the Riveter was made up while flexing. And the sentiment was eventually championed by the U.S. Armed Services, specifically female Marines.
Welcome into the United States Marine Corps Women's Reserve.
Lieutenant Colonel Ruth Cheney Streeter, the first director of the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, wanted her Marines to stand out. So she approached Elizabeth Arden, the founder of the still successful makeup company, to create a standard makeup kit for the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. In the kit was a Montezuma red lipstick, formulated to match the red piping and chevrons on women's uniforms, and a matching blush and nail polish. Every female recruit was issued a kit at boot camp. Failure to apply your cosmetics would result in disciplinary action. And this cosmetic legacy continues to influence the Marines today, as the service branch is the only one to explicitly state in its uniform code that women can wear various shades of red lipstick in uniform. 2. Life quickly changed for Japanese Americans in the months after Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Within months, the U.S. Army discharged all Japanese American soldiers, also known as Nisei, from ROTC programs. Many others were discharged from active duty. Japanese Americans also had their draft status changed to 4C, an enemy alien classification, making them draft ineligible. And in February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order that forced West Coast residents of Japanese descent into what the government called relocation centers. A majority of the incarcerated were American citizens. However, all this did not stop a group of Nisei ROTC students with the Hawaiian Territorial Guard from answering the call of duty. They petitioned Hawaii's military governor to create a volunteer labor battalion, which was granted and called the Varsity Victory Volunteers. By building roads, fences, and military barracks, students gained the trust of the military on Oahu Island, proving the Nisei were loyal to the United States. As protests and lawsuits mounted, the ban on Nisei in the military was lifted in February 1943, and the Varsity Victory Volunteers were replaced by the segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 442nd was 2/3 Hawaiian-born Nisei and 1/3 Nisei soldiers from the mainland, some of whom joined while incarcerated in the government's relocation centers. They joined the European Front in Italy in May 1944 and served in Europe until the end of the war. Perhaps inspired by their motto, "Go for broke," the unit became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in all of U.S. military history. In total, the 14,000 or so men who served in the 442nd earned 9,486 Purple Hearts, 21 Medals of Honor, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 4,000 Bronze Stars, and an unprecedented 8 presidential unit citations. President Harry Truman presented a citation to the 442nd, saying,
"You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you've won."
In 2019, the Pentagon and Army recognized April 5th as its annual Go for Broke Day, honoring the 442nd for their sacrifice and service. 3. The Medal of Honor is the highest military honor for valor that a U.S. service member can receive. And of the over 3,500 medals awarded, Dr. Mary Edward Walker is the only woman to have ever received it. Walker graduated from Syracuse Medical College in 1855, becoming only the second woman to graduate from the institution. At the onset of the Civil War in 1861, she went to Washington, D.C. to join the Union Army as a surgeon, but was denied commission as a medical officer because she was a woman. Deciding to volunteer as an unpaid surgeon instead, she worked in frontline field hospitals from Virginia to Tennessee. In 1863, Walker's medical credentials were finally accepted and she became the U.S. Army's first female surgeon. At the time, Walker was given the title Contracting Acting Assistant Surgeon Civilian, a key detail to remember for later. As an Army surgeon, Walker routinely crossed enemy lines, treating civilians and soldiers, which led to her arrest by Confederate troops in 1864 for spying. She never admitted to it and was released 4 months later in a prisoner exchange. President Andrew Johnson recognized Walker's contribution to the war by awarding her the Medal of Honor in 1865. But the requirements to qualify for Medal of Honor were broader back then, and the terms were later updated in 1916 and 1917. The changes resulted in 911 medals being rescinded, including Dr. Mary Walker's, because she was never commissioned as an officer and served as a civilian. But Walker continued to wear her medal until she died in 1919, and President Jimmy Carter later reinstated it. In 2023, Army Base Fort A.P. Hill in Virginia was renamed in her honor as Fort Walker under the Biden administration's push to rename all military bases named after Confederates. The Trump administration has since reverted the base back to Fort A.P. Hill. 4. Of the 350,000 Black U.S. service members who served in World War I, nearly 90% were assigned to labor support units due to discrimination. But one segregated infantry regiment came out of the war highly decorated and renowned, the 369th Infantry Regiment. The unit that would eventually be known as the Harlem Hellfighters started out as the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, the state's first all-black National Guard unit. It was made up of residents mostly from New York City's Harlem neighborhood. But once the U.S. entered World War I, the unit was expanded to include volunteers from across the East Coast. The 369th Regiment arrived to France in December 1917. After unloading ships and building roads and railroads for 3 months, they were transferred to the French Army and put on the front lines. The 369th Regiment jumped into the trenches on April 8, 1918, and stayed on the front lines for 191 days, the most time spent in continuous combat by any American unit of its size during the war. They never lost a foot of ground, and no member of the group was ever captured. It's believed their German enemies called them the Hellfighters because of their ferocity in battle, and eventually the Harlem Hellfighters nickname stuck. The regiment became the first Americans and the first regiment of all the Allied armies to march into Germany in November 1918. By the war's end, 171 Harlem Hellfighters earned the Croix de Guerre Medal, France's highest award for valor, as well as a Croix de Guerre citation to the whole unit for their acts of heroism in combat. But despite their fame and heroism, some veterans of the Harlem Hellfighters were lynched by white mobs after their return to the United States. And while some members of the regiment eventually earned honors like the Distinguished Service Cross and a Medal of Honor from the U.S. government, it wasn't until 2021 that Congress voted to award the Harlem Hellfighters the Congressional Gold Medal. 5. 18,000 Marines and one Devil Duck landed on the shores of the Japanese fortified island of Tarawa on November 20th, 1943. You heard me right, one duck stormed the shores of Tarawa as a Marine during World War II. One in a New Zealand pub, Marine Corporal Francis Pappy Fagan took ownership of the duck before heading into the Pacific Theater. Becoming an unofficial member of the Marine Devil Dogs, the Devil Duck was dubbed Sergeant Siwash after a Sergeant Jack Siwash Cornelius. For the record, Siwash is also a derogatory term for indigenous people native to the Pacific Northwest, so we'll just call the animal the Devil Duck for the rest of the video. A great morale booster for the Marines, the Devil Duck went ashore during the invasion at Tarawa, a heavily defended island that was the first of many bloody battles the Marine Corps fought in the Pacific. Supposedly, the Devil Duck took down a Japanese rooster during the attack. Fagan told a St. Louis newspaper recalling the encounter saying, quote, "The rooster didn't have a chance," and that the duck chased him 30 feet up the beach. There were initial talks among the Marines to award the duck a Purple Heart, but it was instead decided to give the Devil Duck a citation of bravery. It said the duck, quote, "Though wounded on the head by repeated pecks, he soon routed the opposition. He refused medical aid until all wounded members of his gun section had been taken care of." The mighty Devil Duck participated in 2 more battles in the Pacific Theater, the Battle of Saipan from the boat and onshore at the Battle of Tinian. At Tinian, Time and the Marine Corps' own newspaper reported the duck captured a tiny Japanese duck. But those tales might be inflated, as Fagan later admitted in his own retirement event that back in Tarawa, the Japanese chicken, quote, chased the hell out of her. And that brings us to a rather humorous point. While the Marines initially believed the duck was a he, at some point between the Pacific battles, she started laying eggs. The beloved Devil Duck eventually returned home with Fagan and lived out the rest of her days at Chicago's Lincoln Park Zoo. She died in 1954 from liver disease thanks to her days drinking beer, specifically warm beer, with her Marine brethren. Her body was later taxidermied and presented to the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia. For PBS News, I'm Cecilia Lallmann.
Support journalism you trust. Support PBS News. Donate now, or even better, start a monthly contribution today.